Maybe they're still.
Yes.
Oh, there.
Yeah, there we go. Okie dokie. Okay, so is everyone able to see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, cool.
Yeah.
All righty, so we'll go ahead and jump forward here. So today, we're going forward with the nervous system. And so today we're going to be taking a look at the spinal nerves and the spinal cord. So before we get into this, I have a quick question for you guys. So let's kind of take a quick kind of scenario. Just take a random scenario here. Let's say, for example, you guys were, playing around as kids, and you put your hand on a hot stove, okay? Or even as an adult, you put your hand on a hot stove. I'm going to ask you a scenario. Which of these two happens? Do you either think, hey, that's really hot, and then pull your hand away, or do you pull your hand away immediately and then think, man, that was really hot later? Which one happens most often?
Pull your hand away.
Away. Yeah.
Right, you pull your hand away, right. Yeah, you pull your hand away first, and then you think about it later, right?
Yes.
And so that's going to be really important. And that's going to be one of the major roles of the spinal cord because the spinal cord is going to be involved with regulating and maintaining a lot of your reflexes. Okay? And so reflexes are really important because they help to protect us from dangerous situations, right? So if you were to put your hand on a hot stove, and then, for example, let's say you needed to process it with your brain first before you pull your hand away. Okay? In the time it would take you to process that information and say, hey, that's really hot, and then pull your hand away, okay, you might cause some significant, burns to yourself, okay, which you don't want to have happen. Okay? And so the spinal cord helps to regulate all those reflexes and help you escape from that danger and then think about it later so you don't make that mistake again. Okay? So the spinal cord is going to be really important for regulating a lot of reflexes and then regulating what your muscles are going to be doing. Okay? So that's one of the really important functions of the spinal cord. Okay, so for today, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be looking at the spinal cord and how it's structured. Okay, we're going to be looking at the structure of a nerve, and then we're going to look at a few different nerve plexuses and which nerves are going to supply which different areas. Okay. Once we do that, we're going to take a look at what happens if the spinal cord gets damaged at a certain point, okay, and then look at how paralysis can take place. And then we're going to look at some sensory motor tracks, and then look at how reflexes will work at the end of this. So that is our game plan going forward. Okay, so when we look at the spinal cord, okay, the spinal cord is going to be sitting in an area, okay, inside of the vertebrae. Okay, so if you remember when we were looking at bones, the vertebrae had this very large hole in it called the vertebral foramen. Okay, the vertebral foramen is where our spinal cord is going to be located. Okay, so that's going to be where our spinal cord is going to be sitting. So the spinal cord, and one thing to kind of keep in mind here about the spinal cord is that sometimes people use the spinal cord and the spine interchangeably, okay, which is not true. Okay, you cannot use the two interchangeably. The spinal cord refers to just the nervous tissue, okay, which we're going to be talking about today, and the nerves associated with that, whereas the spine refers to like the actual vertebrae. So there are two different things here. Okay. So when we're looking at the spinal cord, like we talked about, the spinal cord is going to be responsible for regulating and controlling all of your very quick reactions and a lot of your reflexes. And a lot of those are going to help you, like I said, to either maintain homeostasis or help you escape from danger, okay? Or help you kind of remove yourself from a dangerous situation. Okay? Now, the way it's able to do that is it's going to have a particular site inside the spinal cord that's going to be responsible for integrating the information. Okay? So if you remember from Monday, integrating the information is where we're going to be processing what information is coming into our nervous system. Okay? And so we don't want that information going to our brain because it's going to take too long for it to get there and too long for us to be able to think about it. Okay? But what's going to happen here instead is our spinal cord is going to have an integrating center that's going to help us respond very quickly to that stimuli or to that stimulus. Okay? So it's going to help to kind of regulate your reflexes in a pretty good amount of, pretty good level here. Now, what's also really cool about the spinal cord is it's essentially going to act as a liaison between your body and your brain. Okay? So all of your sensory impulses, anything that you feel on your skin or on your muscles, are going to run from your sensory nerves. They're going to hit the spinal cord from there, and then again, hit the brain. Okay? So that way the brain can then process that information. Okay? Whether it's a very quick reflex or something that triggered a reflex, or whether it's just some random pressing on your arm or something like that. All that sensory information is going to run from the body through the spinal nerves or sensory nerves to the spinal cord and then to the brain. Okay? And then at the same time, okay, the brain is able to control your motor movements by telling your spinal cord what to do. Okay? And then your spinal cord will actually have the nerves to actually stimulate your muscles. Okay? So the brain, the spinal cord, and your body are all going to be working together, but the spinal cord is going to be the middleman that connects the two. Okay? So the spinal cord needs to be available, needs to be active in order to help the body communicate with the brain and vice versa. Okay? And so when we look at the spinal cord is actually continuous with the brain, meaning that they're actually going to kind of run into one another. Okay? And so the two of them together are going to form the central nervous system. All right, any questions so far on anything we've kind of introduced here?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
All right. Okay, so like we've talked about previously, the nervous tissue is a very, very sensitive and very delicate tissue. And it's also extremely, extremely important. Okay? Now, because the nervous tissue is so very delicate and so very important, it needs to be protected a lot. Okay? And so there's one of the things that's going to be able to protect the vertebral column, or protect the spinal cord here, is going to be the skull, okay, which is going to protect the more superior portions of the vertebral column or of the spinal cord. While the vertebral column will actually protect the major, like long portions of the spinal cord. Okay, so it's going to protect the majority of it. Okay. Now, when we look at where the spinal cord is going to be found, okay, it's going to be found in the region that we call the vertebral canal. Okay. So earlier we talked about the vertebral foramen, which is where our spinal cord is going to be found. Okay. But when you line up all of your vertebrae kind of in a single file line, okay, all of the vertebral foramina are also going to be in a single file line as well. Okay? And so the spinal cord is going to be found inside that long canal that we just formed from the vertebral foramina, and that canal is called the vertebral canal. So that's going to be where our vertebral column is, or our vertebral column will be able to protect the spinal cord. Okay, so that's the first structure. The bones are going to be the first structure that are able to protect the spinal cord here. Okay. The second thing that's going to be able to protect the spinal cord are the meninges. Okay, so the meninges are these three membranes that are going to sit either in between the skull and the brain, or between the vertebral column and the spinal cord. And we'll look at what those look like in a second. Okay, so that's going to be the second component that's going to help protect our spinal cord. The third thing that's going to help us protect our spinal cord is the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid that actually sits around the brain, and it actually sits around around and within the spinal cord itself. Okay? And so what this fluid does is it essentially acts as a shock absorber and acts as a cushion, okay, for the nervous tissue. Okay? And so what you can kind of think about is, I'm going to go ahead and draw out, hopefully this kind of works. So let's say we're drawing out a little bowl here, right? Let's say this is our bowl. Okay. And let's say we have, a little, let's say just a ball just kind of sitting in our bowl. Okay. And inside this bowl, we've got some fluid. Okay. So we got some fluid here, just some liquid, water, whatever you want to call it. Okay. So this bowl is going to represent, your skull or your vertebrae, kind of the bony portion here. Okay. The ball here is going to represent your nervous tissue. So we'll just call this our spinal cord. So I'll just put SC for spinal cord here. Okay. And then this fluid is going to represent our cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Now, the reason it's going to be able to protect our nervous tissue is because let's say we want to come up and we want to smack our bowl. Okay, we hit our bowl on the side. Okay. But if we hit this bowl on the side, our nervous tissue isn't going to go anywhere. Okay, because it's being protected and being kind of buoyed and kind of lifted up and held in place by that cerebrospinal fluid. That fluid is going to act as a physical cushion and a physical shock absorber for this nervous tissue to make sure that it doesn't end up running into the side of the bowl or running into the side of our skull or our vertebral column, and help to keep it protected. Okay. Does that make sense? Kind of acts as a shock absorber and kind of keeps everything in place.
Yes.
Yep. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So, and that's especially going to be incredibly important when we talk about the brain next week. And so it's a buoyant fluid, and it's going to sit in between two of our meningeal membranes. Okay. So this is what our meninges look like. Okay, so here's our spinal cord. Okay. And then surrounding the spinal cord, we're going to find these 3 layers of connective tissue that are going to surround it. Okay? And so again, these are going to surround both the spinal cord and the brain. Okay? The outermost layer is called the dura mater. Okay? Dura mater meaning hard mother, which protects the brain or the spinal cord here. Okay, so that's going to be the outer meninge here, or meninx. Okay. The middle layer is called the arachnoid mater, and that's going to be what we find in the middle here. Okay. And then the innermost layer is called the pia mater. Okay. So all 3 of these membranes are going to work together to protect the spinal cord. Okay. Now, in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, okay, there's going to be a space, and that is called the subarachnoid space, which you see over here. Okay. So the subarachnoid space is going to be where we find the cerebrospinal fluid, okay, which protects our spinal cord. Okay, so like we said before, the spinal meninges, so the meninges around the spinal cord are also going to be continuous with the meninges surrounding the brain. So the spinal meninges and the cranial meninges all kind of blend into one another. Okay, let me. All right, so this is what our spinal cord would look like here if we were to look at a cadaver. Okay, so if we kind of removed everything, here we see our vertebrae and then our vertebral column, which is where we would find our spinal cord located here. Okay. And so this would be the actual spinal cord itself. And then surrounding it, here we see the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. They all join together. We see the space here, the subarachnoid space, and then lining up adjacent to the spinal cord, we would find the pia mater. Okay. All right, so now we're going to look at the whole kind of anatomy of the external spinal cord here. Okay. So the spinal cord itself is going to be about 1/2 inch in diameter at its thickest regions, and then as you move a little bit more inferiorly towards the thoracic region, it gets a little bit narrower. Okay. And so what's kind of interesting about the spinal cord is it's really only about 1.5 feet long. Okay. It really only runs from the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest portion of your, or one of the lowest portions of your brain, okay, all the way down to about the L2 vertebra. Okay. So it really only goes down to about midway to your back, which is a little bit of kind of a curious little thing here, right? So how is it that our spinal cord only runs midway down our back, but we're still able to control, what our toes are doing? Okay, we're still able to feel our legs, we're still able to feel our toes. How is it able to do that if our spinal cord stops midway through our back? Okay, well, we'll get to that in a second. So what actually happens here, and it's kind of interesting, is that when you're born and up until you're about age 4 to 5, okay, your spinal cord is going to grow. Okay, your spinal cord is going to grow and elongate until you hit about age 4 or 5. Okay? Once age 4 or 5 hits, okay, the spinal cord stops growing at that point. Okay? But the bony vertebra will continue to grow. Okay? And so because the spinal cord stops growing, okay, it just stops right here at around what eventually will become the L2 vertebra. Okay? So we'll kind of come back to this in a little bit and to look at how exactly our spinal cord is still able to control our legs, even though it stops at our L2 region. All right, so the first thing that we're going to see when we look at kind of the major aspects of the spinal cord, okay, is we're going to see a region called the cervical enlargement, okay, which appears around the the C4 to T1 vertebrae. Okay. So at the C4 to T1 vertebrae, we're going to see that our spinal cord begins to bulge outward. Okay. And so this is going to be the region where all of our nerves that run to and from our upper limbs, our arms, are going to be coming from. Okay. They're all going to be running to and from the cervical enlargement here that run from C4 to T1 vertebrae. Okay. In addition to that, we're also going to see the lumbar enlargement. Okay. Now, the lumbar enlargement is a little bit of a misnomer here because it runs from the T9 to the T12 vertebrae. Okay. But it's called the lumbar enlargement because when when our vertebrae first stopped growing, okay, or our spinal cord first stopped growing, it was at the lumbar region. Okay. And then we started to grow, okay, and now it's really only about the T9 to T12 vertebrae. Okay, but that's another thing. Okay, so lumbar enlargement is at the T9 to T12 vertebrae here, and so this is going to be where all of the nerves that run to and from our lower limbs are going to be coming from. And so right here, where our spinal cord begins to bulge out again. Okay. Now at the tip of the lumbar vertebrae, or the tip at the end of our spinal cord, okay, we're going to find a region called the conus medullaris, which is a kind of a cone-shaped ending here. Okay? And that point is going to end at about the level of the T1, or sorry, the L1 and L2 vertebrae. Okay, so we got our cervical enlargement here, okay, at the lumbar enlargement here at the T9 to T12 vertebrae, and then it ends at the conus medullaris. Okay. Now, around the conus medullaris, we're going to find a little piece of tissue called the filum terminale, which is actually a bit of an extension from the pia mater. Okay? And so the filum terminale is going to run inferiorly, okay, until it reaches your coccyx. Okay? And so what it's going to do is it's going to actually fuse the arachnoid mater and the dura mater together, okay, and then anchor those to the coccyx and it kind of hold your entire spinal cord in place. Okay, so this is what anchors your spinal cord and keeps it from kind of shifting to the side or shifting any which way. It kind of anchors it specifically here to the coccyx. Okay. Now, another thing that we're going to see here, and this is going to be what helps us to control our lower limbs, is going to be a region or a set of nerves called the cauda equina. Okay, so at around the conus medullaris, we're going to see kind of a flaring out of all this nervous tissue, okay, that comes from this particular region. Okay, and so all this nervous tissue will kind of flare outward, okay, inferiorly and then at an angle, okay, and flare out downward until eventually it reaches into the legs. Okay. And so for that reason, this is going to be what helps us to control, you know, our toes, be able to feel our toes and feel our legs and things like that. Okay. We have the cauda equina here, which translates to horsetail, okay, and so because it actually physically looks like a horsetail, and so it descends at an angle and inferiorly from the cauda equina, sorry, from the conus medullaris all the way down into your legs. So it'll supply all the lumbar regions, the sacral nerves, as well as the coccygeal nerves, and then eventually supply your legs and your toes and things like that. Okay. Any questions so far on the external anatomy here?
So the phylum terminal anchors, you said? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so the phylum terminale will anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx and hold everything in place here.
So how do they reach the spinal cord for the epidural during?
Sorry, say that one more time.
The epidural liver pain injections. How do they reach the spinal cord?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So for epidurals, let me kind of go back here. There's a space here called the epidural space. And so essentially what doctors will do is they'll kind of, there's a very strategic way to do it. I don't know the specifics of how it actually happens. But essentially what they'll do is actually kind of pierce the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then eventually get into the epidural space. Okay? And so in doing so, because the epidural space has that's gonna be where you actually insert the epidural into, that's gonna be what kind of numbs or it's supposed to kind of numb everything during, you know, childbirth, things like that.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions here? Cool. Yeah, so that's that. Okay, so this is just a picture of a cadaver, what this whole process would look like here. So here we're looking at the cervical region of the spinal cord. So here we would see kind of the dura mater and the arachnoid mater being cut here. Here we see the inferior portions of the spinal cord. Okay, so here we see the phylum terminale, which anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. And we also see the cauda equina up here. Okay? And so the cauda equina, like I said, are going to be all those nerves that are going to run from the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions, and then run down into your legs, so you're now able to control and feel what's happening around your leg regions. Okay, so now that we've looked at the external anatomy, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the internal anatomy of our spinal cord. Okay, and so we're going to take a look at some of the big picture things and then kind of work our way and get even more nitty gritty here. The first thing that we're going to see is called the anterior median fissure, okay, which is a very wide, very thick groove on the anterior side of the spinal cord. Okay. That's the anterior median fissure. Okay. Then on the posterior side, we're going to see another groove called the posterior median sulcus. Okay. So this is going to be a much narrower groove. It's usually not as thick or as long. And so that's one way that you're able to differentiate the anterior side from the posterior side of your spinal cord. Okay. But there's a few other ways, and I'll show you that in a bit. Okay. The next region that we're going to see is called the gray commissure. Okay. And so when we look at the spinal cord, we're going to see this gray matter here in the middle. Okay. And this gray matter is going to be kind of shaped like an H or kind of shaped like a butterfly. Okay. So the crossbar of our H here, or the crossbar of our butterfly, okay, is called the gray commissure. Okay. And so this is what allows the neurons on the one side of the spinal cord to be able to communicate with the neurons on the other side, okay, if necessary. So this region here is the gray commissure. Now inside the gray commissure, we're going to have a hole, okay, inside the middle of the gray commissure called the central canal. And so the central canal is actually going to run right down the entire length of the entire spinal cord, okay? And that is going to be another region where we find cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? So we find the cerebrospinal fluid inside the subarachnoid space, okay? And then we also find it here inside the central canal as well. Okay? All right. And then the last structure here that we're going to see is called the anterior white commissure. And so the anterior white commissure, or sometimes called the ventral white commissure, just connects the white matter on the right side of the spinal cord to the white matter on the left side. And again, allows the two to be able to communicate with one another. All right, so that's that. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some white matter, and then we're going to look at some gray matter here. Okay, so the gray matter, which again looks like our H here, is going to be made up of a bunch of neurons, or specifically neuronal cell bodies. Okay. And so when we talk about a cluster of neuron cell bodies that are all located inside the central nervous system, we call those nuclei. Okay. So these nuclei are going to be, the nuclei for sensory and motor neurons, and we're also going to find a bunch of interneurons here as well. Okay. And so this gray matter is going to be divided up into a few horns. Okay. The first horn that we're going to have is called the anterior gray horn, which is going to contain all of these cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. Okay? So all of the motor neurons that control our muscles, okay, those are all going to be based here inside of the anterior or ventral gray horn. Okay? The second gray horn that we're going to find is called the posterior or the dorsal gray horn. Okay? So the posterior gray horn or the dorsal gray horn is going to be where we find all of our interneurons. So it's going to have the cell bodies and the axons of the interneurons, okay? And it's also going to have just the axons of the sensory neurons, okay? So axons of sensory neurons and then entire interneurons are going to be found inside the posterior gray horn, or the dorsal gray horn. Okay. The third gray horn that we're going to see in certain regions is called the lateral gray horn. Okay? Now the lateral gray horn is only found in the thoracic segments of the spinal cord, the upper lumbar, and the sacral segments of the spinal cord as well. Okay. These are going to be the only places where we're going to see the lateral gray horn. Okay. Now, inside the lateral gray horns, we're going to find all the autonomic motor nuclei. Okay. So all of the motor nuclei that will control your internal organs, like your visceral organs. Okay. So your lungs, your heart, your GI tract. Okay. All of those motor neurons that are going to control all those visceral organs are going to be found inside the lateral gray horns. So they're going to regulate your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and then your glands as well. All right. So those are the gray horns there. Okay. So especially keep these first two in mind. The anterior gray horns will contain the cell bodies of your motor neurons, and then the posterior gray horns will contain the axons of your sensory neurons, okay, as well as the entire interneurons. So we'll come back to this topic in a bit later. Okay. Then we have a bunch of columns here, white columns. And so the white columns are going to be where we find our white matter. Okay. Anyone remember what makes our white columns white? Why are they white? Why do they look the way they do?
Does it have something to do with like fat, like a different type of material?
You're on the right track. Some kind of lipid.
Yeah.
We talked about it on Monday.
Ah.
What makes our white columns
Schwann
white?
cells, wasn't it?
What was it?
Not necessarily Schwann cells, but because
The
this is going to be in the
axons?
central nervous system.
Oh.
What do those cells make?
Mm.
Mm.
White blood cells?
Not white blood
Not
cells.
the white blood cell. I don't think so.
What's in our white matter here?
Is it cerebral fluid? Like,
No, not cerebral fluid.
No, that's in the central canal. That's cerebral.
It has to do with helping our action potentials.
I'm blanking out, George.
yeah.
Anyone remember? Starts with an M.
It starts with a what?
Starts with an M.
An M.
An M. I feel like someone's gonna get it. Watch, like someone's gonna look in their notes right now, and someone's gonna get it.
Someone's got to get this one. This is an important one.
Yeah, heck yeah, I feel like it is. Someone look in their notes.
What's the next letter?
It's Y.
M.
M-Y.
Myelin. Someone type.
Myelin.
Myelin.
Myelin, right.
Myelin.
So our axons here are going to be myelinated, which helps our action potentials move faster, remember? So that myelin is going to be made of a lipid, okay? And so because it looks like a lipid, it's going to take on that white color. Okay, so everywhere where we see white matter, we know we have myelinated axons. We're going to have action potentials that are going to be moving faster than they would in gray matter.
Which provides insulation to the nerves, correct? The myelinated
Exactly.
sheaths.
It's going to
Yeah,
provide
and-
insulation to the nerves, which helps those action potentials move faster.
So we have Schwann cells surrounding the actual nerves, right? And then
Yes.
the myelin
So
is
Schwann
above
cells are only going to be, so Schwann cells will only be in the peripheral nervous system. Whereas here we're looking at the spinal cord specifically in the central nervous
okay.
system.
I get it. I
So
get it. Okay.
these we would be finding our oligodendrocytes over here.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I think
So
I was
the
waiting for
oligodendrocytes would be
Schwann cells.
producing the
Okay.
myelin in this particular.
I get it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when we're looking at our white matter here, our white matter is going to be divided up into 3 regions or 3 columns by the gray matter. Okay. This first region is going to be the anterior white column, okay, or the ventral white column. On the posterior side, we have the dorsal white column or the posterior white column. And then on the lateral side, we'll have the lateral white columns. Okay. And so these are going to be important to help us be able to regulate what our muscles are going to be able to do, and then allow our muscles and our skin and the rest of our body to be able to communicate with the brain. And we'll look at that in more detail later. Actually, we're going to talk about it right now. So those tracks here, okay, these white matter here are going to contain all these axons that are going to be myelinated. Okay? So they're going to have lots of myelinated axons, and all these bundles of axons are going to be what we refer to as tracks. Okay? So these tracks are going to be what we find inside the white matter here. So we've got 2 types of tracks. Okay? We have sensory tracks, which are going to take sensory information from our body, okay, run them up from the spinal cord, and then allow that sensory information to get to the brain. Okay? So for that reason, they're also called ascending tracks because they ascend from the spinal cord up to the brain. So this is going to be where our sensory impulses, this is going to be the pathway that our sensory impulses are going to take in order to reach the brain. Okay. Now, at the same time, we're going to have some motor tracks, and some motor tracks are going to be running down from the brain, okay, down into the spinal cord, and then eventually the spinal cord will be able to take those motor impulses to our muscles to be able to help us move. So these are called descending tracks because, again, they descend from the brain down to the spinal cord. So sensory tracks will always have either a common origin or a common destination, and same thing with motor tracks, either a common origin or a common destination. But again, sensory tracks are going to take sensory information to the brain. Motor tracks are going to take motor impulses from the brain down to the spinal cord and then out to the muscles from there. Okay, so this is a larger picture here to kind of show all the pieces to everything that's going on. Any questions so far on the internal anatomy before we dive a little further here?
No.
George, is there anything special about unmyelinated axons at all? Like, I think that was like from last, or not from last, from
Yeah,
from last
so
chapter. Is
not
there anything
really.
special?
There's not particularly. The only how do I say this? Unmyelinated axons, they're still able to do everything that myelinated axons can do. The only thing is they're just not conducting those action potentials as fast. They're
Okay.
a little bit slower, or well, I guess significantly slower, but they still move pretty quick through those axons, just not as fast as myelinated axons.
All right, and then myelinated create white matter, you said?
Yeah, so the
white matter.
myelin is what contributes to the white color of the white matter.
Got it, okay.
Good question. Any other questions here? Okay, so this is what it would look like in a cadaver. And so as you can see here, we have the anterior median fissure, which like I said, is a much larger, deeper, kind of wider groove on the anterior side, whereas on the posterior side, you have the posterior median sulcus, which is a lot thinner. So that's that. And then again, you see your anterior gray horn, you see your posterior gray horn, our gray commissure here in the middle, and then our central canal right there where we find our cerebrospinal fluid. And then again, you see the white columns and so on and so forth. Okay. All right, so question here. So which of the following is false? Okay, so we got A, vertebrae and vertebral ligaments protect the spinal cord. B, the meninges include the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. C, between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is the subarachnoid space. D, the dura mater, or sorry, between the dura mater and the skull is the subarachnoid space. Or E, all of these are correct. Which one is false?
I would say D.
D.
Between the
Okay, so I
dura
hear
mater
D.
and the skull is subarachnoid space, right? That should be wrong.
Oh yeah, it's not. It's
Okay,
not,
does
yeah, they would think
anyone
it's
agree?
D.
Anyone disagree?
Yeah, I think it's D between the dura mater and the skull.
I think it's D too.
Yes,
Isn't
that
it-
is
Yeah, isn't that like between
false.
the spine,
Right.
right?
It's not in between the spine per se, but which parts of the spinal cord anatomy is it? So that subarachnoid
Like the
space is
lum-
going to be found actually in between the arachnoid mater.
Between
And the
arachnoid
pia
mater and the
mater.
pia mater, yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Cool. Good. Good. Okay, next question. So in the figure shown, what is the indicated structure? Okay, this is the inferior end of the spinal cord. Is this the lumbar enlargement, the gray commissure, the cauda equina, the filum terminale, or the conus medullaris? And we're talking about this point here.
Conus medullaris, right? It's that cone
I'm hearing
shape.
conus medullaris. Do
Yeah.
we agree? Do we disagree? What do we think?
Agree.
Going once, going twice.
This is indeed the conus medullaris.
Conus.
Right. So the conus medullaris is going to be the most inferior point of the spinal cord, and so it's going to be kind of shaped like a cone. Okay, perfect.
Mhm.
All right, good. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the spinal nerves. Okay, so the spinal nerves are actually a component of the peripheral nervous system, okay, which again makes sense because the central nervous system is just the brain of the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is everything else. Okay? So the spinal nerves and all the branches that come from the spinal nerves are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? Now these are really important because these spinal nerves are going to be able to connect our body to our central nervous system. Okay? They're going to act as kind of the connection here, the communicating, or the method of communicating here. Okay? For your sensory neuron, or so your sensory receptors, your muscles, and your glands to all be able to communicate with the central nervous system. Okay? They're going to require all these spinal nerves in order to do so. Now, what's kind of interesting, kind of helpful about these spinal nerves is that there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, okay? And all these spinal nerves are going to be hand in hand with the same number of vertebrae for that particular region. Okay? The only exception is with the cervical nerves. Okay? So, for example, we have 7 cervical vertebrae and then 8 cervical nerves, or 8 pairs of cervical nerves, I should say. Okay? With the thoracic vertebrae, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and then we have 12 pairs of thoracic nerves. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae and 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 sacral vertebrae before they fuse, 5 sacral nerves, and then 1 coccygeal, or 1 vertebrae, and then 1 coccygeal nerve. Okay? So it has the same number of nerves as vertebrae in that particular region. The only exception is the cervical nerves, okay? And the reason for that is because the C1 nerve, okay, the first cervical nerve, actually originates in between the occipital bone and the C1 vertebrae. And then you have the same number of nerves, going on from there. Okay? So we have a total of 8 cervical nerves as opposed to 7 cervical vertebrae, okay? But there's the same number of everything else. Okay. So keep that one in mind because that's going to be helpful down the road here too. Okay. So now that we've kind of looked at nerves, we need to look at what a nerve actually is composed of, right? So we first have a nerve fiber. Okay? A nerve fiber is just a single axon, okay, and all the glial cells that are associated with that particular axon. Okay? So a nerve fiber is just one single axon from one single neuron, okay, and all the glial cells associated with that. Okay? However, a nerve, okay, is a bundle of nerves, a bundle of axons all held together. All those axons and all of their neuroglial cells all wrapped in some connective tissue and all held together. Okay? That is what we consider one whole nerve here. So that's what we see here. This would be one nerve, and we see all of these different nerve fibers and all these axons all bundled together by this connective tissue. Okay. So when we look at our nerve here, it actually looks very similar to the anatomy of a muscle fiber. And it's going to have similar names too. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to see is we're going to find the endoneurium, which is going to look kind of similar to the the endomysium of muscle fibers. Okay. So the endoneurium is going to be an area where we have some connective tissue that surrounds one single axon. Okay. So we have one single axon and all of the neuroglia around it, and then a bunch of collagen, fibroblasts, macrophages. Okay. And they're going to be wrapped in this endoneurium, which is the connective tissue that holds that axon together. Okay. So you have an endoneurium surrounding each individual axon.
All it is connective tissue?
Now when we have so it's just connective tissue.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah, just connective tissue. Okay. Then the next thing that we're going to see is we're going to find a bunch of our axons all kind of clumped together. Okay? And we're going to clump them together, and we're going to give it a similar name, or a name that we've seen before, called a fascicle. Okay? Again, we saw fascicles when we were looking at muscle fibers. Okay? We're going to look at the same thing here. So a fascicle is just going to be a bundle, okay, of all of these axons kind of all held together. Okay? So this would be one fascicle, okay? And our fascicle of axons is going to be wrapped in some connective tissue called the perineurium. Okay? So the perineurium here is going to wrap our fascicle containing all of our axons here. Okay? So our perineurium is going to contain lots of collagen fibers. And so what the perineurium is going to be able to do is it's going to be able to regulate a lot of the fluid and kind of salt concentrations around those particular axons. Okay? And that's going to help to make sure that those action potentials are able to work effectively. Now, when we take multiple fascicles, okay, of nerve fibers here, or multiple fascicles of our axons, okay, and we wrap them in this big sheet of connective tissue, okay, that sheet of connective tissue is what we refer to as the epineurium. Okay. And so the epineurium will contain all fascicles, and that will hold our entire nerve together. Okay. So this entire structure here would be our nerve, okay, and the nerve gets wrapped inside this epineurium. Okay. And so this epineurium is going to be important because it's going to give the nerve a little bit of tensile strength. So if for some reason the nerve ends up getting pulled, okay, it's not going to be able to pull apart or stretch too far. Okay? It's going to be able to maintain its integrity. Okay? And it's also going to contain a few blood vessels as well. Okay. So just kind of recap here, we've got the endoneurium. Okay? So the endoneurium is going to surround each individual axon. Okay? When we have a bundle of axons all together here, we're going to call that a fascicle. Okay? And where our fascicle is going to be wrapped inside the perineurium. Okay? And when we have a bunch of fascicles all wrapped together, okay? All these fascicles together is going to be made up or comprising our nerve. Okay? And so this nerve is going to be wrapped inside the epineuria. Okay.
So is the myelin shape different from the endoneurium?
Yes. So the myelin sheath, so her question was, is the myelin sheath different from the epineuria? So yes, the myelin sheath is actually different. So here we would find our epineurum surrounding it, okay? And then we would also find the myelin sheath surrounding that, and kind of on top of that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Here we don't see it, but in most cases we would see the myelin actually coating around the epineurium itself.
Okay.
Is that purpose, the myelin
Actually,
sheath,
yeah, go ahead.
is that for like for shock absorbing, or what is the purpose of the myelin sheath around them?
So the myelin sheath, it basically prevents any sodium or any ions from essentially leaking out and slowing down your action potential. Okay? So the myelin sheath helps to speed up the action potential. Okay, that's really all it does. Okay. So actually, I think I misspoke earlier. So the myelin sheath would actually be around the endoneurium, not around the epineuria.
Yes.
It'd be around the epineuria. Sorry, the endoneurium.
Endoneurium.
Yeah.
So the myelin sheath
Surrounding the
around
endoneurium.
the endoneurium?
Yeah, so the myelin sheath surrounds the endoneurium. Surrounds each individual axon. Okay, any other questions here?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so now going forward here, we're going to kind of look at how our nerves are going to get formed here. Okay, so when we look at our spinal cord, we're going to see some nerves or some kind of branches of these nerves starting to branch directly off of our spinal cord. Okay? So all these little tiny branches here, all these different tiny roots are the rootlets. Okay? So these are all rootlets, all branching off directly from the spinal cord itself. Okay? So we're going to find some rootlets that are on the anterior side, and we're going to find some rootlets that are on the posterior side. Okay? And so what's going to happen here is our rootlets are going to end up joining. Okay? So all the rootlets on the anterior side are going to end up forming our ventral root or our dorsal root here. Sorry, our anterior root. Okay? Our ventral root will be on the anterior side. Our dorsal root would be on the posterior side. Okay? So if you have any anterior rootlets, all the anterior rootlets are going to join together and form the anterior roots or the ventral roots. Okay? And so inside the ventral roots, we're going to find all the axons of our motor neurons. Okay? And so those axons will then eventually be able to reach your skeletal muscles to be able to begin contractions and things like that. Okay? And they can also flare out to any of the glands as well to trigger them to start releasing their substances. Okay? Any rootlets that are on the posterior side are going to end up fusing together, and they're going to form the posterior roots or the dorsal roots. Okay? So inside the dorsal roots, and we're going to find the axons of your sensory neurons. Okay? So, and then those impulses will then eventually reach your spinal cord and then reach the brain from there. Okay? So this is what it would look like here. Okay, so remember, when we're looking at the anterior gray horn, that's going to be where we find our cell bodies of our motor neurons. Okay, that's what we see here. Okay? So the anterior roots are going to contain all the axons, okay, that contain your motor neurons. Okay, your motor neurons axons here, which will eventually reach out to your muscles, okay, or glands. Okay. The flip side of this is if we're looking at the posterior side, the sensory neurons are going to come up through the dorsal root or the posterior root. Okay. And those axons will eventually reach into the posterior gray horn. Okay. So that's going to be important because remember when we were looking at the gray horns, the anterior gray horn contains the cell bodies of your motor neurons. Okay. The posterior gray horn contains the axons of your sensory neurons here, but not the cell bodies. Okay. Okay, everyone kind of following me so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So again, keep those two in mind because that's going to be important here. So all your sensory information is coming up from the posterior side. All your motor information will be exiting the spinal cord from the anterior side. Okay. Now the cell bodies of our sensory neurons, okay, are going to be found inside this big bulge here called the dorsal root ganglion, or sometimes called the posterior root ganglion. Okay. So the sensory neurons here are going to be what we refer to as unipolar neurons. Okay. And so unipolar neurons have their cell body kind of away, and then they have their axon kind of branching out. Okay. So those cell bodies are going to be found here in the dorsal root ganglion, okay, which is going to be on the posterior side. And this is another way you're able to identify whether you're looking at the anterior side or the posterior side of your spinal cord. Okay. So the dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies of all of your sensory neurons. Okay. Now, eventually, your anterior roots and your posterior roots are going to fuse together. Okay. And when they converge, they're going to end up forming a mixed nerve called the spinal nerve trunk, as we see here. Okay. So just to kind of recap this whole thing here. So when we're looking at our sensory neurons are going to be unipolar. Okay. So they're going to have their cell body away and then a very long axon here. Okay. And so that's what we're going to be seeing here. Okay. So our sensory neurons are going to be running from our body up through the dorsal roots, okay, and then into the dorsal gray horn, or the posterior gray horn. All the cell bodies are going to be outside of the spinal cord, inside the dorsal root ganglion. Okay. The motor neurons, okay, are going to have their cell body inside the anterior gray horn, and their axons are going to exit from there through the anterior or ventral roots, okay, out until you reach the effector. Okay. Okay. Any questions here? Because this is one that is important and it usually trips people up a few times. So, any questions on what's going on here?
No, but this is the one that you said that it's very important. We need to take a note of that, right?
Yes, yes. So be very comfortable with this.
Okay.
So what kind of helps me study, when I was first learning it, trying to draw out this whole process. So I'll draw out, the skin, for example, where your sensory receptors would be, where your dorsal root ganglion would be, and then where your motor neurons would be, okay, and where your anterior root. Okay, draw out that entire process because it'll help to kind of keep everything straight for you.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so that's the spinal nerves. Okay, so now that leads us into this condition called shingles. Okay? And so shingles is probably a condition that we've all heard of. And so the shingles virus is actually caused by the same virus that causes chickenpox. Okay? And so when this happens, okay, this kind of tends to flare up later in life after someone has been exposed to chickenpox. And it actually infects the peripheral nervous system, specifically the spinal nerves here. Okay? And so what happens here when people recover from chickenpox, sometimes the virus isn't completely eliminated. Okay? And instead what the virus will do is it'll kind of retreat and sit here inside the dorsal root ganglion, okay, where we have all of the cell bodies of our sensory neurons. Okay? Now, when someone's immune system becomes compromised or that virus becomes reactivated, okay, that virus will then exit out of the dorsal root ganglion and then along whichever spinal nerve it exits from. Okay? And so you end up seeing this blistering, okay, this very red kind of discoloration and this blistering across the body. Okay? And what's really kind of interesting here is that those blistering actually happens along the spinal nerve that is infected, okay, by the virus. So you can kind of identify exactly where, or kind of have a general idea of where that particular virus kind of retreated from, and where it's located. And so this usually will lead to people having lots of pain, like excruciating pain sometimes, some very uncomfortable blisters, and a lot of sensory issues from these. Yeah.
And George,
yeah.
did you actually get shingles more than once, or is it just like a one-time thing?
Oh no, so shingles can kind of reappear. So my father-in-law, for example, he had shingles a few years ago, but it'll flare up every so often. So it'll flare up. Sometimes it'll go away, and then something happens, and then it flares up again. Okay? So it can be kind of a reoccurring thing that you got to deal with.
Oh wow!
And there's not really a good treatment for it either.
Crazy.
Yeah, good question. Good question.
And shingles.
Any other questions here?
If you get shingles late in life, it can even kill you, right?
I'm not sure.
Or
I'm
is
not sure.
Chickenpox?
So I don't think it usually doesn't kill you.
Yeah.
as far as I know, I don't think it does, but I may be wrong. I have to look into that.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a good question. I have to look into that one. I'm not sure. I don't think so, but I may be wrong about that one. I haven't looked into that yet. Good question. Any other questions here?
No.
You can get chickenpox more than once as well too, right? Or no, or is that one time thing too?
Say that one more time.
Oh, I said, can you get chickenpox more than once, or is it a one-time thing too?
I had it twice.
Chickenpox itself. Oh, really? Yeah.
Oh,
So his question was, does chickenpox happen more than once? Typically, it only happens once, but there are a few occasions where it can show up again.
That's crazy.
yeah. Most people, I think it's just once.
Yeah, most people it's usually just once.
Yeah.
All right. All right, so that's shingles. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at our spinal nerves, okay? Remember, our spinal nerves are joining from the anterior roots and our posterior roots. They're going to join together and they're going to form our spinal nerves. Okay? Now, eventually, our spinal nerves are going to branch again into a ramus, or two rami here. Okay? So the rami are just these very large branches of these spinal nerves. Okay? So the first one is called the posterior ramus. Okay? And so the posterior ramus is this guy over here. So our spinal nerve will branch off, and we're going to see a little nerve come posteriorly, and it's going to begin to serve the deep muscles of your back, as well as some of the skin of the posterior trunk as well. Okay. Then we see the anterior ramus, or also called the ventral ramus. And so this anterior ramus would be kind of the rest of it here. And so the anterior ramus will usually supply the muscles of your upper arms and your lower legs. Okay. And they'll also supply the muscles and skin around the lateral and anterior portions of the trunk. Okay. So posterior ramus typically goes to the posterior side of the body. Anterior ramus typically goes to the anterior side of the body, as well as up to your arms and your legs. Okay. This next branch that we're going to see here is called the meningeal branch, and then the rami communicantes. Don't worry about these right now. These will be more important when we get into the autonomic nervous system in a couple weeks. But these are these little different branches here. Okay? And so these branches are going to be responsible for supplying the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So they're going to be responsible for our autonomic nervous system. But again, don't worry too much about these now. We'll get to those in a couple weeks. Okay, so this is just a larger picture. Again, we would see our spinal nerve here, and it'll eventually branch into the posterior ramus, which goes to the back, and the anterior ramus, which would go to multiple other areas, as well as the anterior portion. And then again, you see the meningeal branch and the rami communicantes over here.
So the anterior ramus is significantly larger in size compared to the posterior ramus.
Yes, yeah, the anterior ramus is significantly larger.
Is it because it has the motor function? You think that's why it's? It's kind of like
I think
the muscles, right?
I think because it has motor function, but also because it's just supplying more things than the posterior ones.
Yeah.
The posterior ramus typically just goes to the muscle and then the skin of the back, whereas the anterior ramus is going to the arms, the legs, the anterior portions of the chest, and the muscles around the trunk as well. So there's just more stuff that it's going to be supplying, so it has to have more axons and more nerves in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So again, this is just another picture of what you would see in a cadaver. And here you see the anterior ramus and then the posterior ramus back here. Okay. And then again, here's another picture from a superior view. Okay. And so again, anterior ramus and then the posterior ramus back here, or back here.
So the anterior one is actually the bigger one, right, George? You said?
Yeah, so the anterior one is the bigger one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so his question was, which one, like the anterior ramus is significantly bigger, which is true. The anterior ramus is significantly bigger than the posterior ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Okay. So now that we've taken a look at all of our rami and all of our spinal nerves, okay, the next thing that we're going to be able to do is look at all of these plexuses. Okay? So all of the axons that are running out of these rami, our spinal nerves, are going to form these very extensive networks. Okay? And so these networks are going to be found on both the left and the right side of the body. And so we call those nerve networks plexuses. Okay? And so each of the plexuses is going to be responsible for supplying stimulation to different regions of the body. Now, axons from all over the nervous system, or sorry, all over the spinal cord, are going to be responsible for forming plexuses, with the exception of the nerves, the T2 to the T12 thoracic nerves. Okay? Those ones do not form any plexuses. They just kind of do their own thing. They're more responsible for the autonomic functions. Okay? But they're not going to be responsible for kind of the functions we're going to be talking about here, as far as controlling muscles and things like that. Okay. So we have 5 major plexuses. The first one is called the cervical plexus. We've got the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, the sacral plexus, and then the coccygeal plexus. And so all these plexuses are going to have all these, like a bunch of other nerves that are going to branch out of them, and they're going to supply different regions of the body. Okay. So we're going to take a look at some of these plexuses here. And so the first one is called the cervical plexus. Okay. So the cervical plexus is going to come from the C1 to C5 nerves. Okay. And this is going to be branching on either side of the neck. Okay. So on both sides of your neck here. Okay. And so the role of the cervical plexus is to supply the skin and the muscles of the head, okay, all the skin and muscles of the neck, the shoulders, the chest, as well as the diaphragm. Okay. So here we have this phrenic nerve, and the phrenic nerve is specifically responsible for allowing the diaphragm to be able to contract and relax here, okay, which allows you to breathe. Okay. So that's the cervical plexus. And so this is what it would look like in the cadaver, and it's a little bit harder to kind of make out here, but you can see all these different nerves branching out here. So these are all part of the cervical plexus. The next plexus is the brachial plexus. And so the brachial plexus runs from the C5 to C8 nerves, as well as the T1 spinal nerve as well. Okay. And so this will typically run across the first rib behind the clavicle, and then it'll enter into the axillary area around your armpits. Okay. And so this will supply most of the stimulation to your shoulders and your arms. Okay. So we're going to take a look at a few of the specific nerves here. Okay. And so the first of these nerves from the brachial plexus, okay, is called the axillary nerve. Okay. So the axillary nerve is going to be found inside the axilla area, inside your armpit here. Okay. And that is going to supply stimulation to your deltoid muscles, okay, the muscles that control your shoulder movements. Okay. The next one is the musculocutaneous nerve. Okay. And so that's going to supply all the anterior portion, anterior muscles of your arms. Okay. Then we have the radial nerve. Okay. And so the radial nerve is going to run on the lateral side of your forearm. Okay. And so it's going to stimulate the posterior aspect of the arm as well as the forearm, okay, which we see over here. The next nerve is the median nerve. Okay, so the median nerve lies across the anterior surface of your forearm. So you got to think just right across the front of your forearm, and that's where you would find your median nerve. Okay. And so it's going to supply the anterior forearm and then some of the hand as well, okay, which we see kind of running down this way. And then the last one is the ulnar nerve. Okay. And so the ulnar nerve is going to be on the anteromedial aspect of your arm, okay, along your ulna bone. Okay. And so it is going to supply stimulation to the forearm as well as most of the hand. Okay. So those are the 5 branches of the brachial plexus. Okay. So this is just a picture again to kind of show you where all these nerves are coming from. And so again, this is our brachial plexus. Here we see the musculocutaneous nerve. Here we see the axillary nerve here, kind of in your armpit. And then the radial, medial, and ulnar nerves, which will eventually branch into the forearms. Okay, that's the brachial plexus. Okay. Our third plexus is the lumbar plexus. Okay? And so the lumbar plexus runs from the L1 to the L4 nerves. Okay? And it actually sits inside the psoas major muscle. Okay? And so the lumbar plexus is responsible for supplying stimulation to the abdominal wall, specifically the anterolateral sides of your abdominal wall. It's going to supply the external genitals as well, and then parts of the lower limbs. Okay. So here, for example, we see the femoral nerve, which will supply your femur area, and then a few other ones as well, the ilioinguinal, and so on and so forth. Okay. And so again, this is a little picture of what you would see of all of these nerves on the anterior view and as well as the posterior view. Okay, and that's what you would see in a cadaver. Okay, the fourth plexus is called the sacral plexus. And so the sacral plexus runs from the L4 to the L5 vertebrae, or spinal nerves, as well as the S1 to the S4 spinal nerves as well. Okay. And so they're going to be located inside the sacrum. And so these are going to help to supply your butt. They're going to supply the perineum area, as well as the majority of the lower limbs as well. Now, inside this area, we also find one of the major nerves that comes from the sacral plexus, which is called the sciatic nerve. Okay. The sciatic nerve is, the nerve that comes from here, and this is what kind of runs along the posterior aspect of your leg, and then into your calf muscles as well. So this is one nerve I do want you to be comfortable with too. Okay. Especially because I'm all too familiar with the sciatic nerve.
Yeah.
And then the last one, and then this last one is the coccygeal plexus. Okay. And the coccygeal plexus is inside the S4 to S5 nerves here. And so all the coccygeal plexus does is it supplies the skin around your tailbone. Okay? It supplies the skin around your coccyx. And that's pretty much it. Okay? It doesn't do anything else. Okay. So those are the 5 plexuses. I do want you to be comfortable with the plexuses and what areas they supply. Okay. Especially for the lab practical as well. Okay. And then for the brachial plexus, I do want you to be comfortable with these 5 nerves that come from there. Okay, but as far as any other nerves that come from the brachial plexus, don't worry about them, except for the sciatic nerve. Okay. So just the axillary, just these 5 brachial plexus nerves and the sciatic nerve are the only nerves I want you to be comfortable with.
So the brachial plexus nerves and the what other one for the practical?
So the brachial plexus nerves, be comfortable with, and then also be comfortable with the sciatic nerve, okay, and what plexus this comes from.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions on any of these plexuses?
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
No.
All right. Coolio. Okay, so question here. So in the figure shown, which principal branch of the spinal nerve is indicated? So what branch are we looking at here? Is this the posterior ramus, the rami communicantes, the meningeal branch, the anterior ramus, or the posterior root ganglion?
Is it the anterior?
Anterior ramus.
Yes, it's the anterior ramus. Perfect. So that's going to be the anterior ramus, and that again, that's going to be where all the plexuses are going to be arising from. Okay. Okay. Next one. So what does the dorsal root ganglion contain, or the posterior root ganglion contain? Cell bodies of sensory neurons, cell bodies of interneurons, cell bodies of motor neurons, both sensory and motor information, or cell bodies of sensory neurons and sensory and motor information are correct. What do we think?
Cell bodies of the sensory neurons?
I think it's a sensory.
Yeah, sensory.
For the
Yes,
posterior
so
side.
it's going to be the cell bodies of your sensory neurons. Right. So the cell bodies of your sensory neurons are going to be found inside the dorsal root ganglion. Okay. And then from there, the axons are going to reach into the dorsal root and then eventually into the dorsal brain from there. All right, good. Okay. So now that we've looked at all of our spinal nerves, the next thing that we're going to need to be comfortable with are these dermatomas. Okay. So each spinal nerve is going to be responsible for supplying a specific area of the body. Okay? Every spinal nerve has its area that it's going to be supplying. Okay? A specific area, and it's always going to be a pretty predictable area as well. Okay? And so neurologists, especially people who are experts when dealing with the spinal cord, okay, they need to be comfortable with knowing which spinal nerves are going to be supplying which particular areas. Okay? And so in order to do that, they've been able to kind of produce this way of looking at the body in terms of dermatomes. Okay? So dermatomes are areas of the skin that are going to receive sensory input from a specific spinal nerve. Okay? So for example, this dermatome over here, okay, is going to be supplied by the C4 vertebrae, or the C4 nerve. Okay? This area over here is going to be specifically supplied by the L2 nerve. Okay? So every single spinal nerve has a specific region that it's going to be supplying. Okay? And that region of the skin that it's going to be supplying is referred to as a dermatome. Okay? Now, knowing these dermatomes is going to be really important because if a patient comes in and they say, hey, I'm not able to feel this particular region of the body, okay, then the doctor can then determine, okay, which nerve is actually damaged, okay? And then that can help them to pinpoint where the problem is. Okay? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, almost like the regions, like where nerves are at, right? Specific ones.
Exactly. So those are going to be the regions which each nerve is going to be supplying. Okay? So if there's some kind of damage, if they're not able to feel that particular area, or they're not able to control that particular area, then they're able to know exactly which nerve is the problem. And then they can go in and then figure out what to do to fix it if it is indeed fixable. Okay. There are some areas of the body that are going to overlap in terms of their nerve supply. Okay. So for example, this particular area of the body might be supplied by both the L1 and the L2 nerves. Okay. And so on and so forth. Okay. Now, this becomes incredibly important when you're dealing with spinal cord injuries. Okay? So spinal cord injuries are injuries where you have actual direct trauma to the spinal cord itself. Okay? And this can be due to the spinal cord getting compressed or sometimes cut altogether if there's been some kind of trauma that causes the vertebrae themselves to be fractured or displaced, and then kind of press into the spinal cord, causing some kind of injury, or if there's a blood clot somewhere, that can lead to spinal cord injury as well. Okay. So whenever you have a spinal cord injury, it's usually going to be in specific areas, although it can be in multiple areas, but usually it's either going to be in the cervical region, in the lower thoracic region, or the upper lumbar region. Okay. Those are usually the places where we'll see spinal cord injuries. Okay. Now, depending on the extent of the type of injury that you get, okay, you may experience some paralysis. Okay. And so some minor injuries may not result in paralysis, but it doesn't take much trauma to damage the nervous tissue in a way that causes paralysis. Okay? And so there's different types of paralysis. The first type is called monoplegia. And so monoplegia is where you have paralysis of just one limb. Okay? You have diplegia, where you have paralysis of either both the upper limbs or both the lower limbs. Okay? Now, if it's both lower limbs, then it's more specifically classified as paraplegia. Okay? So paraplegics are typically people who have no control of their lower limbs, their legs. Okay? Some people can have what's called hemiplegia. Okay? And so hemiplegia is where you have paralysis of the upper limb, the trunk, and the lower limb of the body, okay? But just on one side, either the left or the right side. Okay? And that's usually due to a stroke of some kind. Okay? Or you can have quadriplegia, where you have paralysis of all four limbs. Okay. And so the way these injuries typically work is because when you have an injury to a particular region of the spinal cord, okay, it cuts off the communication between the brain and the rest of the body below that. Okay. So for example, here we might have a cut at the C4 vertebrae. Okay, so everything below that is not going to be able to communicate with the brain. Okay. And so as a result, you have complete paralysis of everything below the C4 vertebrae. So that would be a quadriplegia situation. Okay. Over to the C6 vertebrae, and then again, you wouldn't be able to feel anything below the C6 nerve. If it's lower than that, maybe at the T6, okay, your arms are still going to be, operable, okay, but you're not going to have any use of your legs. And then same thing at the L1 vertebrae. It's just different levels of where that damage occurs. So a complete transection, okay, is when the spinal cord gets completely severed from one side to the next. Okay? So if you think of your spinal cord being kind of like that, the long disc, okay, if you cut it completely all the way through, That's what we refer to as a complete transection. Okay? And so that is very bad because what that does, it cuts all of the sensory and all the motor tracks that would be used to communicate between the brain and the rest of the body. Okay? So for example, let's say let's say I were to make a complete transection of the spinal nerve. Let me do this in red. Right here. Okay. So let's say there's a complete transection right there. Okay. Everything above this is still going to be able to communicate with the brain because there's no problem with communication here. However, if there's a complete transection, if we have a cut here, then everything below this cut is going to get stopped at this particular region. Okay. There's not going to have any way of communicating with the brain. Okay. And so as a result, you end up losing all sensation. Okay. You end up losing all sensory input from anywhere below that. Okay. And you lose all motor function of anywhere below that as well. Okay. So complete transections basically cut off all of the communication between the brain and anywhere below wherever that transection took place. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, we recently had a 21-year-old who had stroke, and I think it's the whole right side of the body and even the brain.
Mhm.
So she's undergoing therapy and all that. She doesn't remember anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it can be terrible. Yeah, it can be very
Yeah,
bad.
absolutely, absolutely. My dad had a friend who he had a stroke too. So Sharon was talking about a friend who had a stroke and basically became a hemiplegic, and where you typically have a stroke, it affects one side of the brain or sometimes can affect the spinal cord. And so if that's the case, it basically cuts off communication of one side of the body to the brain.
Yeah.
So my dad had a friend who same thing happened. He had a stroke and then wasn't able to use, I believe it was his right side of his body. So it does become a pretty tough situation to have happen. That's putting it mildly.
And she's 21, just 21. So.
Oh man, see, and that's really tough. That's really tough. Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. So typically when people are dealing with a complete transection, one of the things that they'll experience is what's called spinal shock. And what that means is you will typically start to experience also areflexia, meaning that they're not going to have any reflex function. Okay, so for example, if you have someone who's gotten a spinal cord injury and they become a paraplegic, where they can't use their legs, if you try to give them the knee-jerk reaction, they're not going to have a response. Okay? It's just not going to be able to work. And that typically, again, happens at any reflex that has to do with anything below where that injury took place. Okay. Any questions here?
No, it's crazy.
Yeah, very crazy, very crazy. Okay, so next thing we're going to look at here are these sensory tracts. And so like we talked about before, a lot of these sensory tracts and motor tracts are going to be found inside our white matter. And so you don't need to worry about writing much of this down. Don't worry too much about this. I'll tell you when you need to start writing again. But basically, these sensory and motor tracts are going to run along the white matter. Okay? And so we're going to look at the sensory nerve impulses first. Okay, so sensory nerve impulses are typically going to run from the spinal cord up to the brain, and they're going to be using tracts called spinothalamic tracts. Spinothalamic just meaning it's running from the spinal cord up to the thalamus of your brain. Okay? And that's going to be using the posterior white columns. Okay? There's also going to be these lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts, and what they do is they're going to be sending lots of impulses for sensing pain, temperature, itch, pressure, and then sense of touch. And they're going to be transmitting those impulses up to the brain as well. Okay. The posterior columns are going to be specifically responsible for 5 major sensations. The first one is called proprioception. And so proprioception is essentially just your balance and how well you know where your body is in space. And so it's going to be aware of your body positions using the positioning of your muscles, your tendons, and your joints. Okay. It's going to be responsible for discriminative touch, which just is just the ability to know what part of your body is actually being touched. So for example, if someone touches you, you know they're touching your arm, or you know that they're touching your back, or whatever it may be. Okay. It's responsible for 2-point discrimination, okay, which is your ability to determine that you're actually being touched on 2 different points on your body. It's responsible for light pressure sensations as well as vibration sensations too. And then we're also going to have some sensory systems and so these sensory systems are responsible for sending that information up to your central nervous system and specifically your brain, okay, and being able to tell you about different things that are happening in your environment. It's tell you about changes that are happening in both your external and your internal environment. Okay. And it actually creates a large set of information that your brain can then use to then determine, what to do next. Okay. All right. Cool. Then we're also going to see some motor tracks. And so these motor tracks are going to be found inside the lateral anterior cortical spinal tract and the cortical bulbar tract. Again, don't worry about these names, don't worry about what they do. But just know these motor tracks are essentially going to be running from the cerebral cortex, which is the conscious center of your brain. Okay? And they're going to be sending those impulses down these motor tracks, which will eventually reach your muscles, okay, to help you control voluntary movements of your skeletal muscles. Okay. There's going to be some indirect pathways as well. Okay? And some of these indirect pathways are going to help with mostly reflexes here. Okay? And so they're going to be responsible for some of those automatic movements and automatic reflexes that are going to be happening in response to different types of visual stimuli. Okay? And so there's a few different tracks. Again, don't worry about all these tracks that are going to be involved. But these motor tracks are typically going to be responsible for maintaining your muscle tone, okay, which helps, and then especially with your postural muscles to keep your body upright. It's going to help with maintaining your body's equilibrium, and then by regulating the muscle tone of your neck to help you kind of control where your head's at, okay, in space. Okay, that's that. Okay, last thing here are reflexes. Okay, so at this point, you start taking notes again. Okay, so reflexes, like we talked about at the beginning of today, are responsible for helping you to maintain homeostasis and keep your body safe, okay, and keep you away from danger here. And so there's going to be specific places in the body that are going to be responsible for reflexes, and the major part of the body that's going to be responsible are going to be these integrating centers. Okay. Those integrating centers are going to be both within the spinal cord and within the brain. But for our case today, we're going to be just looking at some spinal cord reflexes. Okay. So these reflexes, when we talk about reflexes are just these very quick, involuntary, unplanned movements, okay, that you perform in response to some kind of stimulus. Okay? And again, the goal of these reflexes is to either keep you safe or help you maintain homeostasis or help you kind of be aware of what's going on in your surroundings. Okay? Now, spinal reflexes are typically going to be responsible for helping you to keep away from danger and keep your body safe. And so these reflexes are typically going to be found acting within the spinal cord's gray matter. Okay? And so one of those examples is going to be the knee-jerk reaction or the knee-jerk reflex. And we'll look at that in a little more detail. Okay? There's also some cranial reflexes which happen inside the brain, okay, like tracking movements of the eye. So if I walk from point A to point B, okay, there's going to be some cranial reflexes that help you to track my movement. Okay? If I'm walking from one side of the room to the other, you're naturally going to watch me with your eyes. And that's going to be that's going to be regulated by these cranial reflexes. Okay. There's also going to be some somatic reflexes. So somatic reflexes are reflexes that help you to control your skeletal muscles. And then we have some autonomic reflexes. Okay. And so autonomic reflexes are reflexes that will control your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your legs. Okay. All right, so when we take a look at reflexes, reflexes are going to work in kind of a pattern, okay? And it's always going to take the same general pattern, okay? And so we call that pattern a reflex arc. Okay? That's a pathway from beginning to end, from the time you sense the stimulus to the time you actually have an action, is what we refer to as a reflex arc, okay? So a reflex arc is going to be made up of the same components as the anatomical components of a normal nervous system, okay? So we're going to have a sensory receptor. And so a sensory receptor is usually going to be the dendrite of a sensory neuron, and it's going to respond to some stimulus. Okay? Once it picks up on that stimulus, it's going to generate an action potential and then send that along your sensory neuron. Okay? Then we have our sensory neuron, which is going to transmit that action potential, okay, along its axon, and send that information to the brain and or to the spinal cord. Okay, again, depending on the particular reflex in question. Okay. Once it reaches the brain or spinal cord, it's going to reach an area called the integrating center. Okay. And there may be one or more integrating centers inside the central nervous system, again, depending on the type of reflex we're looking at. Okay. Some of these some of these integrating centers can be monosynaptic, meaning they have just one synapse, okay, or they can be polysynaptic, meaning they have two or more synapses. Okay. So in a monosynaptic reflex arc, all we have is a sensory neuron directly synapsing with a motor neuron. Okay, so just one synapse is involved there. Okay, and then from there, the motor neuron will then act. Okay. The other case that we can have is called a polysynaptic reflex arc. Okay. And so in a polysynaptic reflex arc, what we have is a sensory neuron that synapses with an interneuron, and then from there, that interneuron will then synapse with a motor neuron, okay? All within a single integrating center. Okay? So here we see more than one synapse, so we call it a polysynaptic reflex arc. Okay? In either case, we're always going to be stimulating a motor neuron. Okay? So once that motor neuron gets stimulated, okay, once the necessary action has been kind of determined by the integrating center, it's going to send that information out to the motor neuron, and that motor neuron will then create a nerve impulse, create an action potential, okay, and send that out from the spinal cord through the anterior root, okay, and then directly to the effector, okay, either the muscle or the gland that it's going to be stimulating. Okay. And so the effector, like I said, is going to be just the body part, either a muscle or a gland that's going to respond to the impulse. Okay, so those are the 5 components: sensory receptor, sensory neuron, integrating center, motor neuron, and then the effector. Okay. Okay, go ahead and mute yourself, whoever that is, real quick. Sorry, last quick thing here. So, last thing here is we're looking at a patellar reflex, which is the knee-jerk reaction. And so this is the particular reflex that we usually see at the doctor when they hit our knee. Wherever that is, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, please. So basically what happens here is we're going to have a stimulus, which is going to be the hammer, okay, that the doctor is going to use. Okay. So when they hit you with that hammer, okay, on the patellar tendon, that's going to cause your knee to kind of flick a little bit backward, and that is going to stimulate a sensory receptor inside the quadriceps muscle called the muscle spindle. So this is the sensory receptor. It's going to generate a nerve impulse, and it's going to run along the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is going to create is going to have that nerve impulse eventually reach the integrating center inside the spinal cord. So at this point, we're going to have 2 different kind of situations happen. The first thing that's going to happen is this synapse, the sensory neuron is going to synapse with a motor neuron here. Okay. And this motor neuron, again, this is happening inside the integrating center. Okay. This motor neuron is then going to create an action potential. Okay. That's going to come back to the quadriceps muscle and cause it to contract. Okay. So in this case, the effector is the quadriceps muscle. And when it contracts, it's going to cause the leg to kick outward. Okay. And that's where you get the kick from the knee-jerk reaction. Okay, so that's going to be a monosynaptic reflex right there. Okay. Now, at the same time that's happening, that sensory neuron is also going to be synapsing with an interneuron. Okay. And that interneuron is then going to stimulate a motor neuron that's going to actually have an inhibitory role. Okay. So this inhibitory motor neuron is going to eventually stimulate, or kind of not stimulate, I guess, the hamstring muscles, okay, and prevent the hamstring muscles from contracting. Okay. And so that allows the quadriceps muscle to not be obstructed by something, and it's going to be able to fully kick all the way out. Okay. That is the patellar reflex. Again, we have the muscle spindle, which acts as the sensory receptor, generates a nerve impulse that goes along the sensory neuron here. Okay. Eventually, it's going to hit this motor neuron. One motor neuron is going to get stimulated and cause the quadriceps muscle to contract and then kick out. The other sensory neuron is also going to be stimulating an interneuron. That interneuron is going to have an inhibitory role on this motor neuron that will prevent the hamstring muscles from contracting. Okay. All right, so that's that. There's a quick video here that kind of shows more detail about the somatic reflex here, especially the knee-jerk reaction. So this is one that I do want you to be comfortable with as well. Okay? Just know the components of the reflex arc and then know how the patellar reflex works. Okay. And that is pretty much it. So we got a few questions here. Okay. So question, so which of the following is the correct pathway for a reflex arc? So go ahead and you can kind of look through it and then let me know which is the correct path. What do we think?
So it has to be C, correct? So we start with sensory receptor, then we go to sensory neuron, integrating center, and then the motor neuron, the effector muscle or organ, whatever it is.
Yes.
Exactly. So C is the answer here. Right. So the sensory receptor is going to be the first one that's going to pick up on that stimulus, right? It's going to generate an action potential along the sensory neuron.
Hello.
We're going to reach the integrating center,
Oh,
where we're going to
hello.
process what kind of information or what kind of action we need to do. The
Hello.
integrating center is then going to communicate with the motor
Yeah, that's
neuron,
not
and then the motor neuron will
nice.
then stimulate the effect. Perfect. Okay, next question. So in the figure shown, what component of the stretch reflex arc carries information about the overstretching of a muscle to the CNS? What is the guy that stimulates this whole process, or that triggers the whole process?
Motor
The
neuron.
effector, the sensory receptor,
B.
motor neuron, interneuron, sensory neuron. Yeah, B is.
Sensory neuron.
Oh, sorry, just kidding. The sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is going to carry that information. Okay. So the sorry, I misread that. Yeah, the sensory neuron is going to carry the information, but that information is going to begin at the sensory receptor.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Perfect. Okay. And that is it for today.
Cool.
Done pretty early today. Any questions on anything we've covered today so far?
I think we're pretty, I guess it's good. Yeah, we're good.
Yes.
All right.
Good lecture. Interesting.
Good.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
interesting.
really interesting.
I agree.
Yeah.
Good.
I kind of thought
All
that
right.
like all those nerves reminds me of like the breaker outside your house, and then it has sections that'll say living room or dining room or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's essentially how it works. Yeah, that's a really good analogy. I haven't thought about that. Yeah, that's essentially how it works.
Yeah.
So each one has its particular area that it's going to be supplied. Exactly. Good.
Yeah.
We thought of them as